Ross McNally. I'm the Chief Executive and Executive Chair of Hampshire Chamber of Commerce, hosting the event today and working in partnership with Mission Performance and Menzies. And also I'd like to do a shout out really to thank all of those who've helped us to distribute our message around the Chamber of Solutions events, the local LEPs and the local partnerships and stakeholders throughout the whole of the county and beyond. And thanks very much for the support. Chamber of Solutions is a new concept for the Chamber of Commerce, but basically it's bringing together all of our stakeholders and businesses locally to try and help find solutions in what are quite extraordinarily difficult times. Today's theme is all around businesses in distress, and I know that some may not be absolutely in distress, but we're all feeling it. And there's no surprise in that, because this is quite an extraordinary period. The changes that are afoot are probably not just for now, but are going to have long-term impact. It's going to address things like business restructuring. There's going to be cost control issues that run for quite a few months. Sector changes, no doubt, will be occurring. There's funding issues afoot, and also many other ways in terms of staff and relationships and suppliers, and all providing long-term impact, and they all need to be addressed. And unusually, they all need to be addressed while we're locked down. So that is quite a challenge for managers and for owners of businesses. And that's why we have this Chamber of Solutions. It's your community of practice. It's here to share knowledge. It's here as your program, your support service. It addresses your needs because you bring them to the Chamber of Solutions, and they find solutions shaped for you. So we want to hear from you, your specific needs, because I think others can learn from those. We have future events coming up. It's every week. It's on a Tuesday at 9:30. We've got funding and cash flow coming up, but there'll be other things as we move forward, as the challenges turn into opportunities, and we want to help you along that path. So this really is the start of your rebuild. It's the start of an opportunity to reshape your business. So I think we should get going. And I'd just like to hand over to Rob and Dave and thank them for doing all the technical parts today. Rob.
Thank you, Ross. Well, with such a great response to this session and the previous one, we've got a few housekeeping rules. So let's get those over with. Turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent. As discussed, turn your videos off to improve bandwidth. A few points just to make sure that we can get the most from the experience. So we'll unmute you to interact. Try and stay muted at all times. You'll be able to see us and hear us, and through the chat function be able to bring your question to our attention, and we can then scan the chat lists and make those questions and feed those into the panel. You can also share your experiences. So towards the middle and end of the session, you can actually share some experiences and address the panel directly. But the chat function is key. Let's just go through the chat function as well as the participants panel in a bit more depth. If you want to ask a question, then you send a chat message to everyone. We will pick up that message, and we will then feed that. Bob, the moderator, will feed it into the two co-chairs and feed it into the panel for answering. Also, to raise a hand, if you go on your participant panel, you'll be able to see an icon, which is a raised hand. If you click on that, a raised hand will appear next to your name, and you'll shoot up to the top of the list of participants. We'll then be able to pick up your question, pick up your raised hand, and then communicate with you on chat, either ask your question on your behalf or invite you to address the panel directly. When you do that, put your first name on your question so that we can ask of you by your first name, and we can feed those into the panel. That's a little bit about the housekeeping. Let's go on and meet your panel. I'm facilitating the session along with Dave Gosling from Menzies. I'm Mission Performance Limited representative. We're a professional business services organization that specializes in changing behavior to improve business performance. 5 practice areas which we deliver globally for a range of different clients. I head up the design services part of the organization, designing whole company development programs. that's a little bit about me. Dave?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Dave Gosling. I'm a partner at Menzies. I head up our Snowdon office, and I'm a member of the firm's management committee. Menzies advise numerous owner-managed businesses. So over the last 2 weeks, I've had many phone calls with clients on the impact of the virus on them and their businesses.
Great, thanks, Dave. And Simon?
Morning, everybody. I'm also a partner at Menzies. My day job is I'm an insolvency practitioner advising predominantly owner-managed businesses and SMEs in financial distress. I started my insolvency career back in 1990, and over the years I've collaborated closely with the Insolvency Practitioners Association and various other regulators in the world of insolvency, culminating in being the president of the Insolvency Practitioners Association in 2007, and I'm currently on the council of the IPA, again collaborating particularly in these challenging times with regulators to understand some of the practical challenges of our end day job at this current time.
Thank you, Simon. And Gary?
Good morning, my name's Gary Lee. I'm a senior manager with Smith & Williamson in Southampton. I work in the restructuring team. I'm also a qualified IP, have been for 10 years or so, following 22 years in public practice. I'm also the current chair of the R3 South and Thames Valley region. R3 is the trade body for insolvency professionals, so helping businesses and individuals to hopefully get out of some financial distress.
Thank you, Gary. And David?
Hi there, my name's David Joel. I'm president of the Hampshire Chamber of Commerce, which is a non-executive role. I'm also managing director of Lanson Consultants. We specialise in strategy and top team development, as well as training. It's a small business, so I'm feeling the same sorts of pain that a lot of you are feeling at the moment, including distress. I also work with the Institute of Directors in London. I'm their faculty head for their diploma in company direction. I'm on the board of a charity and in partnership with a family member in a video business. That's in a nutshell.
Great, thank you, David. Tony?
Yes, morning everybody. I'm Tony Knight. I'm the Managing Director of Knightshire Insurance Brokers. We're specialists in business insurance and have been for the last 30 odd years. I sit on the Small Brokers Advisory Board with the British Insurance Brokers Association. Fielded quite a few questions over the last few weeks on the COVID related and queries. My connection to the Chamber is that I chair the Professional Services Forum.
Great, thank you, Tony. And Aaron?
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Aaron Butson from HSDC, Alton, Havant and South Downs campuses. I'm here really to talk with businesses on the support that's out there, funded support to continue staff training, even furloughed staff, and that just to help businesses realise they can still develop their staff if they're in that position.
Thank you, Aaron. And Justin?
Good morning, my name is Justin Cunningham. I'm an associate consultant with Mission Performance. I specialise in leadership and resilience consultancy. I've delivered for Mission for the last 4 or 5 years. Prior to that, career predominantly in the military. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Matt?
Morning, everybody. My name is Matt Burgess. I am Director of Communication Practice at Mission Performance. My background is as a performer, as an actor in theatre, television and film. I now head up the Comms Squad, which is the part of Mission Performance that is made up of theatre practitioners, actors, directors. We travel around the world working with individuals and organisations, helping them in the way they communicate.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, panel. Just to let you know that this session will be available as a recording, and it will appear on the Hampshire Chamber website, where you can access it or share it with people that haven't had the chance to attend today. So, quick word on the format. We're going to start with Simon and Gary with a broad perspective of the topic at hand, and then we're going to switch to the chat functions and work our way through your questions. We have a few. There's many of them, so respectfully, we won't get through all of them, but we'll endeavour to do so. Okay, so let's start with the first question, the broad question. This one goes to you, Simon. Can you lead us off and give us a sort of broad perspective of this topic as you see it from your experience? Simon.
Thanks, Rob. So the headline, obviously, for today is to look at available strategies and recovery plans. I think if we start with some of the initiatives that have been offered by the UK government as a starter for 10, so to speak. So the initial point and the easy to do point is effectively to stop paying taxes. So VAT, PAYE, corporation tax, and to a certain extent business rates as well. They will give you instant relief. I know the subject of last week was all about the furloughing scheme, so the job retention scheme. That's still a bit of work in progress. The online portal for making applications won't go live until I believe the 20th of April, and hopefully it won't fall over on day one, but that's obviously going to secure funds, but it's going to be delayed. The coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, again, work in progress, but we are hearing that banks are advancing loans to companies and individuals to help with distress. And then the obvious final 2 points are reserve cash. Cash is king. Even if you feel that your cash position is strong at the moment, you need to be extrapolating that out over the coming months. Later today, we should hear more from the government about how long the lockdown is going to last and what a phased return to normality might look like if we ever get back to the norm that we had before. And finally, whilst we're all locked down, I think now is a good time to start imagining and looking forward to the future as to what that means for you as an individual and also what it means for your business. So they're my starters. In fact, there are only 5, but that's a good one.
Thank you, Simon. Gary, do you want to pick up on that?
I think it's some the last point I think that Simon made there is probably key for a lot of people, is to try looking to the future and take the time that you've got now to try and restructure your business. Look where you want to go, how you think you're going to get there. Make sure you revisit any business plans that you have, and also have a close look at your budgeting. It may be that you're sitting there thinking, well, there's no point budgeting because I know I've got no income. But you still need to look at what's going to happen after this period. But you'll also still need to have a look at where your outgoings are going to take you, and to see exactly what level of funding you're going to need. Because one of the things, if you're going to have a look at the loan scheme, is they will ask for forecasts and they will ask you to have some indication of your financial performance.
Okay.
Is it worthwhile talking about the new, or touching on the new legislation which has come out for companies? Some emergency legislation, just so people are aware of that.
In terms of proposed insolvency legislation changes, there was an announcement on Saturday, I think the 28th of March, that there were going to be changes to the wrongful trading provisions of the Insolvency Act, effectively loosening the obligations between now and so I think certainly the end of June, so there'll be effectively a moratorium on wrongful trading prosecutions. The other proposal was a form of moratorium which would enable businesses to be ring-fenced and given a breathing space whilst they're effectively trying to re-establish themselves and assess the position. It would be a lighter touch insolvency process than an administration, but at this current point in time, there's not been any further sort of news in terms of draft legislation, but things can happen very quickly.
So does that potentially mean there's less risk on directors now if they continue to trade?
I think there's always been a question as to what is the real risk of prosecution under the wrongful trading provisions of the insolvency legislation. They are a rare form of prosecution. You're more likely to be challenged in terms of breaching other duties that you have as a director, so more your sort of Companies Act obligations. But I think it's fair to say that the government don't want directors to wake up in the morning, look at their financial position and close everything down because of the current issues. I think they're really trying to create an environment where people are prepared to pull their straps up and work hard to keep effectively a very important part of the UK PLC going, the owner-managed SME sector in particular.
David, is it worth you coming in there with your background and your directors?
Yeah, sure. I think I would agree with Simon. It's not the risk of prosecution as such that's the big deal here. If they change legislation around insolvency, you still have your Companies Act obligations as a director, and those are as stringent as they ever were, although prosecutions are relatively unusual. I think the relaxation is more to try and alleviate the fear that prosecution is not around the corner. You still have to act in the best interests of your organisation, as required under Section 172 of the Companies Act.
Yes. Okay. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of specific questions from the pre-registration. And the first one was that the bank is asking for a personal guarantee. What are your views, Gary, on this one? Personal guarantees on private homes, for example. What experience have you had over recent weeks and months?
I think when the legislation was first brought in, it was obviously a reaction to what was being asked for. So the banks defaulted to some old rules under a previous scheme. That's now been changed. That I believe that if you're having a loan under 250,000, they can't ask for personal guarantees. And over that, I think that your personal property is actually excluded, but that may have changed. So although that doesn't stop a guarantee being called upon and your home forming part of any estate in a bankruptcy, that's, I think, people shouldn't lose sight of, but they can't actually now ask for your private residence as collateral.
That's very clear. Anything to add on that, Simon?
I think the important part in relation to going to the banks and asking for money is that you still have to have a bankable proposition, and certainly some of the criteria that the banks are expecting is that your business was profitable, or the trading aspect of the business was profitable prior to the 1st of March. And I do, whilst I don't always feel empathy with the banks, I do feel that they need to still go through an appropriate level of due diligence before they put money out to support businesses. So they'll need to reflect on the plan as well as looking at the appropriate level of security. I think it's fair to say that a few banks have had a hand on the shoulder explaining that when times were tough for banking, the government helped them. So the government are really expecting the banks to help business at this time.
Dave, anything to add on this conversation?
Dave or David? So I saw David had his hand up.
Dave.
No, I think, what's key, I think, is cash flow at the moment. I just encourage all business owners to do all they can just to forecast cash and look to understand where their cash is going. Speaking with suppliers, enforcing credit terms that they have, and just looking at what options are out there.
Okay. I'm just going to go back to the pre-registration questions. Another one that's quite specific. It's linked to a director's ability to market the company or capacity as a director, even if technically an employee that has been furloughed. So what can a director do or not do in this period if they've been furloughed or furloughed themselves?
I think one of the things you've got to be careful of is the director still has their statutory duties to the company, but anything that, for example, marketing the business, actually, I do think they would fall foul. I don't know if anyone else has a.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Gary, as well. Yeah.
It's a difficult balancing act, isn't it? Because on one hand, you've got to keep the business ticking over to be ready to sprint out the blocks when the starting gun goes, so to speak. And do absolutely nothing. It's a difficult, speaking from personal experience, it's a difficult line to tread, isn't it?
I think a director then just has to weigh up the benefits of making a claim under the furlough scheme compared to the advantages of them staying and working in the business. And I think a lot of the time there's more value in a director working in the business.
Right.
the issue of directors furloughing themselves, it's happening in larger businesses and small ones as well. The knee-jerk has been to try and save cash, and furloughing seems a good thing to do. But there is a knock-on effect that if you furlough yourself, then you can't work in the business, which puts you in conflict with your own duties as a director in terms of working in best interests of the business. So you have to be real careful in furloughing yourself, because you find yourself painted into a corner.
Okay. Well, let's, Tony, with your unique perspective on this, we have a question from the participants, which talks about if an insurance company policy states that we are covered for viruses and or when the government imposed closure, do they not have to pay claims? What's from an insurance specialist, what's your view on that?
Well, I guess the first thing is that, is the cover there in the first place? Now, it's a sad fact that probably up to 90% of UK businesses don't have the cover, and there was a little bit of a media furore because they latched onto a comment in the early days of the announcements from the Chancellor. A little bit of history, basically. For business interruption insurance cover, the norm is that follows damage at your premises causing an interruption to the business. So you have a fire, you can't use your factory. However, up to around 20 years ago, there was a non-damage extension, and that covered things like closure of your premises following a notifiable disease, murder or suicide, defective drains, things like that, and usually capped at a relatively low level of loss of gross profit, from 25k up to £250,000. Now, that all changed 20 years ago. The SARS outbreak completely changed the insurers' outlook, and although we weren't too badly affected in the UK, the writing was on the wall for unlimited cover. And most of the insurers said, we can't underwrite pandemics. We don't know when they will occur, what the size will be, what the demographic will be as to who they'll affect. And so two new models came out around about 2003, 2004, of which one was you have the cover if there's an outbreak of a notifiable disease at your premises. That's particularly difficult to prove, really, when we talk COVID, because how do you prove it unless you've had a positive test of, say, an employee? Then the second model is that which most insurers, ABI members in this country, moved to, was a list of specified diseases, ones that they could underwrite, things like the likelihood of smallpox or anthrax, things of that nature. And none of the flu epidemics that we've suffered in the last few years have ever made it to the list. SARS, swine flu, avian, definitely not COVID, because no one even knew about it until a few months ago. So to be successful with any business interruption claim, first of all, you have to have cover, and I would be highly doubtful whether very many insurance clients in this country have. Some of the larger multinationals do, particularly in the hospitality sector. They bought pandemic cover, which is something a little bit different. It's cost them several arms, several legs in the process, but against their balance sheet, it's good value. Secondly, there has to be a gross profit loss. It's not just a payout of a certain sum of money specified in your policy. So in line with anything else to do with business interruption insurance, there has to be a loss. And that is always calculated after the event by comparing anticipated gross profit in an interrupted period against the expected, the actual gross profit in that same period. So it's very much an actuarial calculation. So from that point of view, if you've got cover, yes, they do have to pay. And the government and the Association of British Insurers have said that the government lockdown regime is sufficient to trigger payouts if there is cover. But as I say at the start of this answer, I fear that very, very few businesses in the UK have got the cover at all.
Okay, Tony, thanks for that. Let's go up a level and talk a little bit more generally with Dave's unique experience working across a number of different industries. Dave, did you want to comment on some of your first-hand experiences of working with clients over this period?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've had many chats with clients over the last 3 weeks, and I won't obviously mention client names, but just touch on the industries they're in and what they're finding. A restaurant business been speaking to, they were quick off the mark. So before the government announced the lockdown, they saw a decrease in turnover. So we did some forecasts for them to look to arrange additional funding. Now, any forecasts are based on assumptions, so they assumed that the restaurant would be closed for 3 months, and that they'd have reduced income for 3 months after that. They have just arranged funding now. They didn't do it through the new government scheme because the bank went up to speed when they put their application in. We've got a construction company who's still working. The sites are still open, but they're struggling to get materials to site. So for them, it might be the lack of materials that stops them working rather than anything staff related. Another restaurant does takeaways, predominantly is eat-in, but does do takeaways. They've now signed up to Just Eats and Uber Eats, and actually has got themselves into a profit position. So for them, they're cash positive at the moment, which is good. We speak to a number of care homes. Now, for them, their primary focus is keeping the virus out of the homes. I've been speaking to a few where they've set up camps in the garden, where they are keeping staff in tents, which is fine when the weather's like this. I'm not too sure when it's wet and cold what will happen there. Their big risk is that they're reliant upon agency workers at the moment. So some of the staff are actually self-isolating, so they're reliant upon agency workers, which are obviously visiting a number of homes. So the risk does increase. We look after hotels, so obviously they're closed. They've furloughed all their staff. Some are trying to just keep some income coming in by doing meals or food packs and so on, but they'll be hit hard. We look after some suppliers to the pub and restaurant chain. Now their income has obviously stopped, so they're focusing on home deliveries at the moment, so a big change to their business. Gyms have closed, obviously. Most of them are looking for some additional funding. A lot of them are franchise gyms, so there's quite a bit of an initial outlay. So there's loans that they're always paying, some overhead costs. On a positive point, there was a home maintenance company I was speaking to last week, and because more people are at home, they've actually seen an upturn in their income. So one positive amongst a number of negatives. We look after some theme parks. They're closed. Easter would have been probably one of their busiest times of the year, so they've been hit hard. And then children's nurseries. So again, they've ceased trading and have furloughed a lot of staff. So a lot of negative stories. I think I've only spoken to one client who's positives at the moment on income, but I think a lot of people are changing quickly.
Is there any sort of common themes which unite companies that are sort of turning it into a positive? Is it sector related? Is there anything that connects those, or is it purely down to the sector and business that they're in?
Yeah, I think it's down to the individuals thinking outside the box. I mean, there's some sectors, obviously hospitality and leisure, that have been hit really hard, the others, it's down to just trying to think differently and just trying to do things differently. And I think in the long term, there will be some positives that come from this. So if I look at Menzies, for instance, I think we will embrace home working more. So for us, we will be able to maximise office costs. I think businesses will look to make the most of technology that they've got available to them. And we probably all shy away a little bit from change, whereas this has actually forced us into it. So there will be some positives that do come from it. But I think it's down to the individuals themselves making those changes.
Okay, thanks, Dave. There's a question I've just sent to you, Gary, about material adverse changes. Would you like to pick that one up?
Yeah, I think obviously the banks are under tremendous pressure to lend. As we know from the last financial crisis, there were a lot of banks that were suddenly enforcing covenants that they hadn't before. I think it's a real balancing act, because what people don't want is to come out of this and find a lot of lending that could then be deemed irresponsible. Obviously, the banks leading up to 2008 had a lot of lending that should never have happened. And I think they are probably quite rightly going to be just a slightly more circumspect in who they're lending to. Flip side, unfortunately then for the banks, is that the government want them to be able to keep business running. So it's a bit of a rock and a hard place, I think. And I think for every business going forward, I think if you are aware of the terms of your lending and you think there's going to be a breach, then my suggestion would be talk to your bank as soon as possible. As with most suppliers, they are a supplier of finance, and they don't like surprises. So my view there would be, if you think you're going to breach your covenants, then please just talk to your bank as soon as you're aware, so that you can then get a handle on what their reaction is going to be, and also whether you can put anything in place to try and overcome that breach.
Okay, thank you, Gary. We had another question that came in. Perhaps this is one for you, Simon, about discounting other borrowings. Would you like to comment on that?
I think that's quite an interesting scenario. I did some planning for myself at the weekend, where I've got an existing loan which I had, which I used to buy a car, which is with a Halifax at sort of 5.6%. I was looking at HSBC, who will do a personal loan for 3.3%, and I kind of wondered whether I should be flipping my borrowing from one bank to another. Clearly, it's a relatively small amount, and would be fairly easy to do. I think if you're looking for a loan under a business interruption loan scheme at a significant discount and perhaps with less security than your existing banking arrangements, I think that the new lender, assuming you're going to a new bank, might take a dim view that you're refinancing some existing debt, if you like, at the banking industry's expense. But frankly, if you can satisfy the lender and you can pass muster, then clearly this is another way of reducing costs at a time when cost reduction is probably the one and only thing that you can actually control, given that revenues in many instances are crammed down. I think the mathematical calculation needs to be, and this is important irrespective of whether you're going to be borrowing money from a bank, is understanding the cost of mothballing your business. What does it truly cost if you hibernate? Can you actually get down to one director or zero directors? Do you have a property cost? Do you have costs in relation to broadband, IT? What are the actual underlying costs? And how long is your business going to be turned off for? And when you turn it back on, what's the revenue stream going to look like when it comes back into play? So cash flow modelling.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I think that we've been talking about some very technical elements. I'd just like to invite Justin Cunningham on the line to share some of his tips of experience about maintaining a level of wellness throughout this period. Justin, would you like to come in here?
Thanks, Rob. I was actually going to reference and go back to what Simon and Gary said earlier about the importance of planning. Yes, clearly from a fiscal and governance standpoint, there are benefits, almost a necessity to that. But planning also brings you a lot of, there are benefits associated with your own resilience and well-being. By being able to plan, you're providing yourself with an inner sense of assurance. And probably prior to COVID-19, we were all, if you're like me, running around focusing on what is urgent, what needs to happen now, what we're late with, whereas the planning function comes under the heading of what is important as opposed to urgent. So this current climate has given us some breathing space to focus on what is important, not urgent, and that falls under the planning function. The flip side to that is recognise, and I'm going to quote Mike Tyson, the boxer, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So do recognise that planning is only ever going to be a basis for change, and you're going to have to continually be updating your plans. But the very fact of doing it provides you with a purpose and a sense of meaning to steer through where we currently are.
Great, thank you, Justin. Dave, I know you've got a couple of questions there that perhaps could be fed into the panel.
Yeah, that's fine. One for Simon and Gary, really. So there's a question on here about the government interruption loan scheme and whether we know, or will that be available when we come out of lockdown? Are there any timescales on it as yet? Do you know?
For my part, I would imagine that sort of low-cost borrowing is going to be needed long after the lockdown ends. So, whereas I think the furlough scheme seems to have an end date at the end of May or June, I suspect that the interruption loan scheme will go way beyond that, and I would imagine at least till December this year, if not into next year.
Yeah, and Gary, is it worthwhile touching on, because obviously the government are guaranteeing 80%, I think, of the loans. Just as if a business hits the worst case position, what happens there, and what happens with the remaining 20%, which would be payable?
Well, the remaining 20%, I'm assuming, the banks will look to the individual. And so I think there's going to be a lot more pressure on personal finances, especially, it's a good question on, we're doing all this now as to what happens when businesses are suddenly finding their income cut. But as was rightly mentioned in the question, when businesses come out, they're going to need capital so they can actually start doing business again. So if they are looking to start supplying again, they've probably not got the reserves that they once had of cash to go out and purchase. I think credit terms may well be tough because there'll be a lot of businesses, your suppliers have got to purchase from somewhere as well. And also if you furloughed staff, I think you may be you will be in a better position because you can bring them just back on stream. If you've already had to make redundancies, perhaps even before the furlough scheme came in, then you've got the costs of recruitment. So the 20% is, in some cases, I think, going to be a significant number that directors and shareholders will be looking at. And it's definitely got to be as part of their planning to see how that will affect them personally.
Okay. And then another question come in, Simon, I don't know if you want to answer this one. So what is your view on how a business needs to deal with a shared office facility landlord that is claiming that you need to keep paying rent?
So as regards landlords, landlords have a number of rights of forfeiture and distraint, which are old medieval remedies, apparently. The legislation has been passed to reduce landlords' powers of enforcement for at least the next 3 months, which means that probably March rent and possibly June rents, not to mention the monthly rents that are quite common these days, will be difficult to collect. I'm the administrator of a particular asset which has a number of tenants, and we're trying to sell that asset, and our concern was obviously what would happen to the rent roll on the portfolio that we're dealing with. We're pleased to be able to say that I think 80% of our tenants paid, which is good news in the short term. But we were anticipating that we'd have a lower payment rate than that. The reality is that you need to communicate with the landlord, and I would suggest you look for payment terms, probably rolling up your 3 months of rent now that you can't pay or shouldn't pay, because your main function should be to preserve cash, and then you propose that you settle those arrears over the coming 12 months, so July through to June next year.
Okay, David, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, just a quickie. From a practical point, we're in exactly that situation with our film business, and to endorse Simon's position, is the key to this is to communicate with your landlords openly, frankly, and quickly. It's not in the landlord's interest for you to go under. They're under pressure as well. They often have mortgages themselves. We've found that we've had a very grown-up dialogue in terms of reduced rent rates and agreements to pay, one, when we can, and two, to pay the arrears over a yet-to-be-agreed time period. But it is about communication. You can't hide from it. If you try and hide from it, it will bite you later. So communicate quickly, I would would suggest.
Okay, thanks, David. Another pre-registration question we had is, what guidance is there on when directors should consider not continuing business? So Gary, did you want to pick that one up?
Formal guidance? Well, I think you've got to look at the position where you think that you're not going to be able to continue, which is it's extremely difficult, because there will be some that will be more optimistic than others. Entrepreneurs tend to be. And it's quite easy, I think, at times for others to look back and say, well, you should have stopped then. I think what you have to do is, if you're making the decision to continue, is record what you're doing. Record why you're making that decision and why you think it's in the best interests. Most of what insolvency practitioners are doing are based around looking at what a reasonable person would do. Mm-hmm. If it looks like there's absolutely no chance of continuing or paying paying your way out of this, because you have to remember that once you believe the company's insolvent, your responsibilities switch from working in the best interest of the company to actually working in the best interest of creditors and not making their position worse. Mm-hmm. But if there are payments that you have to make that in your belief that it will help to save the business, so for example, if you are continuing to trade on a small scale but you still have to keep your suppliers paid to be able to continue to trade, then that's a payment that you do need to make. But it is down to recording the decisions behind it and making sure that when you take a step back that they appear reasonable. But something that one person thinks is reasonable, another will not. So it's a very, very difficult balancing act for directors at the moment.
And when should a director seek the advice of an IP? So when should they come to the likes of you or Simon?
As soon as possible. I think Simon will agree that over the years there have been many businesses that we'd have both seen that if advice had been taken sooner, the business could have been saved. Mm-hmm. And it is down to taking that advice, making sure you're speaking to somebody who is qualified and is actually a member of a regulatory body. There are many insolvency advisors out there, some of whom's advice is better than others, shall we say. But it is definitely, as soon as you think there's a problem, most insolvency practitioners will give you an initial meeting for free. We don't, the clock doesn't start as soon as you pick up the phone to us. We're here to help you decide which options are best for your business or even yourself personally.
Okay.
Picking up on Gary's point, having worked in the world of insolvency for 30 years, I've always tried to encourage people to come and talk to us sooner rather than later, because sometimes we're, I think, shrouded in a sort of mysterious, who are we, what are we, how many horns do we have, and all that sort of stuff. Interestingly, my recent experience over the last couple of weeks is I've actually talked to businesses which are in far better health than I normally talk to. So I've been talking to businesses with, six-figure bank balances, whereas normally I'm used to talking to businesses which owe the bank six-figure sums. So people's attitude has actually changed. I think there's no longer an embarrassment about talking about financial difficulty in the normal way, because frankly, everybody will feel a financial challenge of one sort or another, to the point where they're even going to cash flow forecasts for individuals. I don't think anyone can afford not to look at their finances in detail.
Simon,
okay.
Thank you for
David,
that.
Just to add something to that, there isn't actually a formal trigger point as such, which I think is where Gary was coming from. Remember, as part of your duties of a director, one of the things you have to apply is independent judgment. And it's got that judgment view. One person's judgment might be different to another. It's very wise to talk to people like Simon, who can give you advice, but they can only give you that. The judgment is still yours, okay? You still have to make the call. And only really history will judge you. But it's a judgment call. I mean, there are technical definitions of you being insolvent. You can't pay your debts when they fall due, those sorts of things. But you're going to have to make that call, and best do it with advice.
One of the things I pulled from this discussion is the ability to be able to almost create an audit trail of why you took action when you took them, and advice from professionals like yourself can help. Ross, I wanted to bring you in. You had a couple of points to make, I'm sure, with your perspective.
Yes, I see that a number of people have been asking whether we should be lobbying now around the future, and I think the case is that we should. A lot of what's happened in the last few weeks with the Chancellor's announcements and the variations on those announcements have come because of the major groups, the trade associations and the business associations have got in and talked to number 10, number 11, and got these changes. But I think the real squeeze, I mean, it's not easier, but it's more clear and distinct when you have a particular problem and it's now, and you need to address that problem now. It's far more difficult to be planning 6 months down the track when you have a relatively healthy business now, and you think you might be able to survive 6 weeks, 3 months, whatever the case may be. But what happens thereafter? Because that is the real issue for so many businesses that are speaking to me. And they're basically, therefore, between a rock and a hard place. They don't know whether it's wise and good to be paying all of their areas of overhead or renegotiating those areas. Obviously, they're keeping their suppliers as happy as they can because of those situations. But each one of those decisions is taking cash away from them that they may want to reorder and reorganize in 6 months' time. And they will not know whether the government will have used up its pot of goodwill towards businesses and just let the marketplace take care of itself in 6 months' time, or whether there will be a phase 2 and phase 3 support program, and what that would look like. I suspect not all the funding will have got out, so there may well be phase 1 will merge into phase 2 and 3. But as a Chamber of Commerce, I think it's important that we go out and talk to government and get the voice of businesses so that we can help them in that planning 6 months hence.
Yes.
Can I pick up on Ross, on your comment, but also going back to Justin's comment, which is that the importance of planning now shouldn't be underestimated. So when businesses grow, when revenues increase, then that's the time when the constraints on cash flow and working capital is at its greatest. So there's a danger that when the sort of the green light's turned on, when the go button is pressed, there'll be an expectation that it'll be easy and the challenge is over. It won't be easy, and there'll be a new set of challenges, and we need to start planning for those challenges now.
Yes, that's a good point, Simon. Kathy, you asked a question about financial support for the self-employed. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask that question directly?
Yeah, sure. We are actually an artist management company, so we represent photographers and directors, and a lot of them are self-employed, have got no work at the moment, but they actually have limited companies, so they don't pay themselves necessarily through payroll. So all of them are quite concerned at the moment on whether they're going to get any government funding in terms of being able to pay themselves. If they do pay themselves from limited payroll, they're not going to get as much as what they would kind of get if it was made up of payroll and dividends. So I'm just trying to find some support for them, really, because they're all quite anxious about the fact they've got no finances coming in.
So who would like to pick that one up? Dave, is that one for you?
Yeah, shall I do that? Yeah. So yeah, we're very similar. We act for a lot of companies where the directors have asked exactly the same questions. They can furlough themselves, but there's a lot of risk around that. And obviously a lot of them will be taking a small salary and the remainder in dividends. So the actual grant itself will be quite low. We're not aware of any other grants available for directors of companies. So it's then down to them to look at the loan scheme and then to look at delaying tax payments. So they'll have a personal tax payment due in July, which they can defer. They should be looking at deferring VAT payments. But with regard to any other grants, we're not aware of any, and I'm not aware of any announcements coming either.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think one of the problems is that obviously dividends are drawn from profits, and it has been very good tax planning, which a lot of accountants have put forward to their clients quite rightly. But I think Simon was say as well that we come across this quite a lot when companies continue to pay dividends when they haven't got profits, but also then once a company is closed down and we're in a redundancy situation, directors also find themselves slightly hamstrung by the fact that they've been drawing salaries. So then any help they get from the redundancy and payment service is also just based on their PAYE salary and not the dividends. So it's another one of these balancing acts, unfortunately, for directors of small companies. I'm a member of a Facebook group that's run by a friend of mine that's been trying to give businesses some advice on this, and this is a question that comes up again and again. And as Dave quite rightly said, there's nothing that we've seen on the horizon, unfortunately, that's going to provide any further help, I'm afraid.
My wife is the HR director for a hospitality business and has been furloughing staff left, right and centre over the last few weeks. But interestingly, they have a mixture of scenarios. So you have people who are on a standard sort of payroll, sort of monthly paid, 37.5 hours, 40 hours a week or whatever, easy to deal with. They then have a number of people who are on 0-hour contracts, difficult to deal with. And then they have a whole raft of people who are in part paid through a trunk system where they get tips and service charges and so forth. And I think if you look at those scenarios, and then the scenarios just discussed and IR35 issues going forwards, I think there's going to be a wider discussion when looking at tax planning on the one hand and looking at the security of being on a PAYE scheme on the other. Be an interesting change for the future.
I think that's a really good point, Simon. And also, I think when you look at some industries such as motor dealers, where they are historically on a very low basic and they're making that up on commissions, obviously they're not selling many cars at the moment. So they're going to be feeling the pinch as well. And I think there will be some further conversations around this tax planning and also security, as you rightly say.
So, Gary, thank you for that. Leah, well, let's bring in Leah. Would you like to ask your question of the panel? Property developer and links to business bank conditions. Did you get that one? Simon, would you like to answer that?
So finding it difficult to access business loans as a property developer, saying that as they don't trade, they're not qualified for a loan scheme. I'm slightly intrigued. One assumes, going back to David's point, if you've got mortgage on the one hand and borrowings to fund the purchase of a property, you'll need to service that borrowing somehow. If your rent roll dries up, it may be that you go back to the existing borrower and you have a discussion with them about deferring terms, rather than perhaps going out and borrowing fresh money from elsewhere. That would be my thought.
Leah, would you like to come back on that? Unmute yourself and address the panel.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, so our bank is saying because we're property developers, we are not classed as a trading company, so we can't access the loan schemes.
Yeah. Gary?
Yeah, I think as Simon said, that's slightly odd. I haven't read the conditions in detail, but I think that's just, it's another conversation, unfortunately, to have with
overheads too.
It's that's an odd stance. I think unfortunately I seem to be standing up for the banks a lot today, which is unusual. But I think they're in a difficult position that they are trying to respond very quickly to announcements that are being made, and they're trying to find their own footing themselves. So
if you're taking the position as a developer, one would assume that you'd have your development funding in place to complete your...
Yeah, well, so we have our development funding in place, which covers the builds, but then obviously our office overheads are quite high. So without money to support that, like our house sales are being postponed, falling through. So to cover those costs in the meantime, that's what we initially wanted the loan for.
I think you do qualify. I mean, there's a big difference between a property developer and a property investor. So if you're building houses to sell, then you are classed as a trading business. So I'd suggest going back to your bank and give me a shout afterwards if you want, because I can have a word with them if you want.
Yeah, okay.
Also, I'm assuming, Leah, that you've got a history of previous developments and sales.
Yeah.
So you are actually showing a trading history.
Yeah. Well,
I'm assuming, Leah,
to our bank with all of these details, but he's saying, our bank manager is basically just saying he's tried his end, and it's Lloyd's that are saying that property developers don't qualify.
I'm assuming, Leah, that you're a registered company and you pay corporation tax and all those good things. It sounds as though that's an oddity of your particular bank, and it might be looking at some of the other providers.
Okay.
That helped me.
I guess the thing that would have changed significantly as well, sorry, Larry, is that from what you were saying, you were cash flowing the business through sales, and the sales have dried up. And I'm guessing fairly lumpy sales means that your development funding alone doesn't cover that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So that's what we need the funding for, basically, just to cover our overheads until the sales start picking back up again.
Well, I suggest perhaps you touch base with Dave after the call, or Gary, and they can help further on this one.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Leah, for your question. Let's go to James Mann. James, would you like to address the panel directly? This is the point about the landlord with a number of properties.
Yeah. So we're a landlord. We have a number of properties. We're doing deals with them in terms of paying their rent, etc. But we were just about to exchange contracts on a hairdresser. We're in there at the moment, kind of doing up the property and getting ready for them to move in. At the moment, we are liable for the rates because we haven't exchanged contracts. Are we liable for, or are we able to access the retail, leisure and hospitality grant as a landlord?
So
key question one there would be, have your local authority written to you to say that you qualify?
No.
I must admit, for all the clients that I've spoke to, the local authorities wrote to them. We've had one in Portsmouth who've been told they're going to receive the money today. So I think it's a phone call with the local authority first to see.
Is that on an empty shop, Dave?
No, it's on a trading business. I must admit, I'm not close enough to the legislation to know whether vacant premises qualify or not.
The grants for businesses are whether you're paying the rates. Your use of it is academic. We've just been through this on our two businesses here, one of which is relatively dormant, but we still pay rates on it.
Yeah, we're still paying rates on that business.
Exactly.
As a recommendation, I would suggest that you stop paying any rates altogether at the moment.
Yeah.
That you liaise directly with the rating authority and open up a dialogue with them and find out how it unravels from there. But I really wouldn't, if you've got a standing order or direct debit for the rating authority, I would cancel it for the moment.
Yeah.
The only thing you might just want to consider is we've got a number of tenants on the site I'm currently on that aren't qualifying because the amount of rateable value on their property is outside the range that allows you to get.
We're at 16,000, so we would qualify for the 25,000.
So does that help, James?
Yeah, thank you very much.
So let's go.
Rob, we had a pre-registration question on the grant as well, probably for Simon and Gary. I don't know if you can answer it, but someone asked if they receive the grant and the business then closes, whether they're liable to pay it back. That's quite specific, and I don't know if you know the answer to that.
I can say that I don't know the answer, and I didn't have an opportunity to research it over the weekend.
Okay.
I'm not sure, actually, whether you will have to repay it as it's a grant, because you wouldn't be recording it as a loan or a creditor. So at the moment, And again, same Simon, I haven't looked at this particular point, but I'd be surprised. But then there's going to be a lot of things that come out of this that are going to surprise me at some stage anyway. So
the important point about a grant is that in theory a grant is paid away and given to you, and there's no repayment to make in relation to it. But what you need to be clear about is that you haven't breached the terms of applying for or qualifying for the grant. So this goes back to the furloughing scheme. It's a grant payment, effectively. You don't have to repay. But if you've secured funds by way of a false application, I think you should proceed with caution.
Can I just bring
another point just to add into there, if it's just worth for a moment, is if you receive the grant and then you wind your business up, as Gary pointed out earlier, in winding up and put your creditors first. So if you do have a grant, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be yours. You'll be using that to pay out your creditors. So it's the business that has the grant.
Thank you, David. Mo, I'm going to invite you to address the panel on your question. Mo? This was the question about the containers and hauliers point from Southampton. Mo, are you there?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
You need to speak up a bit, Mo.
Is that clearer?
Yep, go on, go for it.
Right, brilliant. Yes, just a question on furlough, because our company already, because of how vessels arrive into Southampton, it was difficult to run the whole fleet on employed drivers. So out of a fleet of 35, we have 20 that are full-time employed on 0-hour contracts, obviously. And the rest of the trucks are run by agencies whenever we have an inflow of work. But we are noticing now, we already reduced most of the trucks and we are running around 25 trucks at the moment. Again, 20 employed and 5 agency drivers. And from next week, I think after this short week of Easter, it's going to go absolutely quiet on us, and I'll be lucky to get 10 or 15 trucks out on a weekly basis. Now, from what I understand on furlough, it's a minimum of 3 weeks. So I was asking if we do furlough about 10 of my drivers, and on some days I need 15 trucks out or all 25 trucks out, and I need to get more agencies in. Would that be in breach of the furlough rules? Because technically I had drivers that are sat in furlough. I could have brought them back in, but we ended up using agencies because the work was only for 2 days, essentially, or 3 days out of the full week or the full 3 weeks.
Let's carry on. Aaron, can you talk about the possibility of training people whilst on furlough?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's coming up quite a lot actually through our network. Is if people like apprentices or full-time staff or any salary staff are put on furlough, are we allowed to train them? The government is actually pointing towards using furlough as a good use of people's time to continue training. The caveat is they're like anybody else on furlough now. They can't do anything that is going to bring any profit into the business. So they can't use this time to market the business or anything like that. So they follow those same rules. But we can use government funding, apprenticeship schemes, and other funding that's out there to train staff. So it's quite a good use of time at the moment to do that.
Good. It's always, I know it's from personal experience. I know we're just working with a client that wants to do training whilst their people are furloughed, so that helps me.
Rob, can I just go back to Mo's point? Because I think obviously because we got interrupted.
Yeah.
With regards to, I think what you look at, as you rightly said, that furloughing, you have to be for a minimum of 3 weeks. Yeah. So at the point you make that decision, you have to be certain that you're not going to have, your belief is that you're not going to have enough work for your employees. It's not clear as to what then happens on a short-term basis, which you're saying that you may go down to, say, 10 employees and then suddenly have work for a couple of days. I think it goes back to the point I was making earlier about making a reasonable decision in the basically recording why you furloughed drivers at that point, and then the decision that if you suddenly need someone for 1 day to use agency workers. The one thing we don't know is exactly how HMRC are going to look at this after this is all over, because one thing is for certain, they will be under pressure to try and recover funds for the Treasury. So it's a catch-22, I think, unfortunately, because it's something that I don't believe specifically covered, and it's just making that decision that you think as a reasonable person is something that you need to do for your business. I hope that's helped slightly, but I'm probably not giving you the definitive answer that you require.
I think as well, Gary, that Mo was right. The minimum period is 3 weeks to furlough someone.
It is, yeah.
If you do bring them back in that time, it does mean that you can't claim under the grant.
Yeah.
I think it's down for each business to try and establish what their ultimate number of staff is, and then if need be to manage workloads accordingly.
Yeah.
I think there's also a logistical and planning kind of question here, and going back to one of my favourites is communication. So, Mo, if you can go back to your clients and get work up a decent schedule of operations as to what needs to be delivered to whom and where and when, you might be able to kind of run the business with your own resource and have some less people furloughed and not use agency workers.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Can I just bring Aaron in here? And can you state your question and answer it? So support that colleges and training providers can provide employers and employees, please.
Yeah, sure. So for all the businesses that can continue with trading or with even with staff on furlough, if they're still in the position where they want to develop the staff when we come out at the end of this, then most colleges, if not all colleges, and most training providers do have access to quite a number of pots of government funding. So, for example, colleges have the adult education budget, which is for learners 19 years and older. And most of that is either fully funded or co-funded training. Staff can access that on furlough, as I said earlier. They can continue to do this training. And most of us, again, most colleges, most training providers have managed to put most of the learning that we do online now. So there's various distance learning tools that we're using. HSDC, for example, we use Google Classroom, but there are other platforms out there that people are using. So all the learning's going on there. And then, of course, we've got this use of video conferencing that we can use to continue any one-to-one training. So with things like the adult budget, there's a lot of training taking place now through my own college with people in things like some very specific training. There's English and Maths continues, IT continues, but there's also some very specific vocational training. But on top of that, there's European social funding training funds out there that people use for things like upskilling the workforce. So through the Solent LEP, the Solent LEP, led by the prime contractor, and this is CSW Group, there's access for learners to get training onto the higher level qualifications, level 3 and above. So if anybody's interested in getting their staff up trained on that, there's various providers involved with this, with as I say, CSW Group being the lead provider. I suggest people go on to the Solent LEP website or to CSW itself, which is www.csw.co.uk, and have a look at what training's available for them, because this is a good time, I think, to use this. And then, of course, if you're unfortunate enough to be having to make people redundant, there are pots of money out there to support the redundancy of staff. Again, CSW Group is the prime contractor on that, but they've got a whole host of subcontractors underneath that are delivering that training for people if they need to support staff through this difficult time.
And whilst we're talking about staff, Matt, I know you wanted to come in some time ago. Was there any particular advice on the way that we communicate with our people in these difficult times?
Yeah, absolutely. Just picking up on something that Ross, Simon and Gary have all alluded to, is that we're talking about very technical things. We're talking about businesses in distress, but there's another side of that, which is human beings in distress as well. And one thing that we know is, as we go through, as human beings, as we go through any form of change, there are anxieties, stresses, we find ourselves in distress. I suppose the simple point is now is the best time to talk. Now is the best time to speak. That quite often we clam up when we're going through difficult periods. But I'm not going to say that a problem shared will always be a problem halved, but it certainly helps to talk and try and find counsel with others, try and speak to people who aren't necessarily the normal circle of friends or people that you might speak to. I know, Dave, we had a question. Do you want me to touch on that as well, Dave?
Yeah, basically, so it's quite an interesting one. So it was, how does a member of staff go about raising concerns on viability of the business with the management? So obviously quite an interesting question. So yeah, if you can do that, that'd be good.
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult because I'd hate to advise on a relationship that I don't know or don't understand. So everything is situational, and judge the relationship that you have with your leaders well. But if I were to give any advice, it would be to talk, to take the lead on it, to be brave, to be honest, because you may find that it helps the leaders of the organization to speak to it as well. And kind of from a leadership point of view, preempt that. Try and find ways, I know that we're working virtually, but try and find ways to talk and ask the right questions so that if people are anxious themselves, and if they're, you know, going through those levels of anxiety of finding it difficult to sleep, that kind of thing, if you can hear about that and address those before they're having to ask you, it can help.
Okay, thanks, Matt. But we had a question as well for Simon and Gary about charities and whether we've got advice for charities suffering difficulties.
My view on charities is obviously that the trustees of a charity probably have slightly more onerous obligations and duties than a director of a limited company does. You're looking after, or you're the custodian of funds that have been raised and collected for a good cause. In one of the challenges obviously might be that your income has dried up. I guess as a charity it depends what your program of donations looks like. So if you're effectively raising funds to disperse, it's fairly straightforward. If you've got a more complicated situation, then you might need a regular flow of trading income, and if you haven't got that income, then you're going to be in trouble. What I would do with that is look to approach the Charity Commission and have a dialogue with them, either approaching them on your own, or as Gary would no doubt suggest, with assistance from an insolvency practitioner or other advisor.
Yeah, I think the government announced some funding for charities. I must admit, I don't know enough about that, but I'm sure they announced a.
They did, and also the Lottery Fund have announced that they have got additional funds available for charities as well. So we're also currently talking to a number of independent schools who obviously have charitable status, and are finding that, you know, parents may be loath to pay fees for the summer term when their children may not actually be attending school. Mm-hmm. And also that it's difficult where they've got children of key workers, that they may have to have staff working, so they can't furlough them, for example, but they're only having to be there for a few hours a day. But yeah, as Simon rightly said, it's if you think you're going to hit that position where there's going to be some distress, then talk to somebody as quickly as possible. I know a lot of charities also have much more income through legacies. Now, whether there are legacies on the pipeline that you may be able to talk to executors to see if they can be released earlier. And obviously, again, as I mentioned with the schools, if you do have employees, then consider whether there's anyone you can furlough. If you have shops, then obviously they'll have been closed, but again, have you spoken to your suppliers to tell them that they're closed? Have you spoken to your insurer? As Tony will tell you, that if you're closed, that does change things. And it's just... And it's just, you know, talk to as many of your suppliers as possible so that you can mitigate your costs.
Aaron, you had a question and an answer?
Yeah, so one of the questions we're getting is about apprentices and apprentices that are coming to the end of their program that may be furloughed now. For those that are unaware, apprentices now take a endpoint assessment, which is basically an end of test, really, an exam at the end of their apprenticeship. And a lot of those are face-to-face assessments, particularly in craft apprenticeships, things like chefing and engineering, things like that. So they're obviously going to be quite difficult to do. So one of the questions that we're getting asked a lot is what's going to happen if the endpoint assessment can't take place, and how will that affect the apprentice? What's pretty clear at the moment is that the funding body is not inclined towards awarding apprenticeships without taking the endpoint assessment. So unlike the GCSEs that school kids are going through now, and A-levels for some of the students where they're going to be given that assessment, as it stands at the moment, apprenticeships are still going to have to finish with their endpoint assessment. However, we've got examples where some of our apprentices are managing to take their endpoint assessment still because they're not craft related. So they've done similar to this, discussions like this. So there's some multiple question type assessments that people have taken, and also some professional discussions. And we've had some examples in the last week where things like some business administration, some leadership and management, and even some junior content producer, marketing style apprenticeships, our endpoint assessments have still taken place, and we've got some due to take place this week. However, if there is a face-to-face bit required, it does look like the learner's going to have to go on a break in learning, which means we get them into the gateway, the so-called gateway, which is preparation for their endpoint assessment. The funding will stop being drawn at that point, and we'll be in discussions with the organisation that carries out the endpoint assessment as to when we can reschedule it, and a shift in that end date will be put in place, so that nobody's disadvantaged here, employer or learner. There'll be no extra cost to the employer at all. The funding will be the same if they're a levy payer or if it's a government funded apprenticeship. None of that will be affected at all. That was agreed at the beginning. And the face-to-face assessment will take place as and when it can, when all this is over.
Thank you, Aaron. We've got about 5 minutes left. So if any further questions from the floor, now is your opportunity to ask them. I know we had one about our degree apprentices still being recruited. One for you, Aaron, perhaps.
Yeah, we personally don't do degree apprenticeships, but we are still recruiting apprentices where appropriate. At our level, we go up to level 5. So I would suggest, is it Chris here that's asked the question? I suggest they go to the universities because they tend to be the more degree apprenticeship one. My suspicion is yes, they are, because we're still recruiting if it's appropriate.
Rob, as well, I mentioned last week when we had the call that Menzies have or recruit degree apprentices each year. So we're taking on about 24 this year. So we've gone through and done our recruitment process as well. So I know a lot of businesses doing the same.
Okay, thanks, David. Any questions, final questions from the floor before I hand over to Ross to close this particular session?
So there was one, Rob, which a pre-registration one which came through, probably for Simon and Gary, and someone questioned what are our thoughts on the economic recovery for the UK? What will it look like? I guess timeframes as well. So I don't know, it's quite a broad one. So I don't know if Simon and Gary want to pick some up with the thoughts on that.
So what does the future hold? I think we've all touched on the fact that we do need to start looking at the future and contemplating what that means. I think we'll hear more from the UK government today about what return to work looks like. I think it will be phased. I think social distancing will be here for a long time. I think hospitality, so pubs and restaurants in particular, will kind of open last. I think we'll be watching what happens in Spain and Italy in terms of, I think Spain kind of go back to work. I think we'll see a sharp increase in insolvencies initially. I think at the moment insolvency numbers are probably relatively static because even insolvency practitioners are finding it challenging to actually put companies into a formal process. It's happening slowly, but it's not happening at a great pace. And then I think once business returns to normal, there'll be an increased number of insolvencies, which will probably peak, and I think numbers will be high for at least a couple of years. So an increase over 6 months, and then a decrease over the following 18 months. But I think it's going to be challenging, and I think everyone should really be planning, as Justin was saying earlier, plan now and plan hard.
Great, thank you, Simon. Well,
I think the other thing that we need to also look that's still on the horizon is we've got the B word that's still going to have an impact on the economy as well, which I think at the moment everyone would like to perhaps get back to talking about Brexit, because it's a bit more of a change, but that's going to also have an effect because obviously the negotiations aren't going on at the moment. So that's also going to have an effect on the economy in the future as well, as to whether the government decide to seek an extension or whether they go ahead with the plan to leave whatever on 31st of December.
Great. I'm just conscious of the time, everyone on the call. I think that some of the things that I'm going to take away from this are the importance of doing what you would do anyway: proper audit trails, proper planning, proper consideration, seeking professional advice. Those sorts of things will remain a constant. But I'm sure, Ross, you'll have some thoughts to bring this session to an end. Over to you, Ross.
Thanks very much, Rob. First of all, I want to thank you, Rob, but also Justin, David, Simon, Gary, Matt, Aaron, Tony, and Dave for the brilliant panel and support that you've provided to the Chamber today. This is the second Chamber of Solutions event that we have organised, and obviously we're learning all the time, and we'll certainly be learning about Zoom bombing, I think, from today's experience. But it's been a really interesting and I think extremely informative session, and I know from the feedback that we've been getting from the participants that likewise they feel the same. One of the things from the Chamber point of view, from my point of view, is really strong messages back to government and to the banks, that fundamentally, you know, this relationship that they are building and the backing that they're giving to the banks through the British Bank must not be just for Easter. It's got to be for the whole year. It's got to be something that goes through the whole of the next 6, 9 months, 12 months. Because otherwise, what will happen is that each of these businesses will find themselves having what you might call normal conversations with their bank down the track. And I think that would be unfair on the business community and unfair on the economy. So that's the big takeaway that I have from it. Obviously, this, as I said from the outset, this is your community. This is the community of those that are participating. And thank you so much for all of your interesting questions. The changes that we're going to be seeing now are going to have major impact for the future, and is going to influence the way we rebuild. Now, we either see this as an opportunity, which I think most businesses do, or we're going to try and get back into position as we were. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to see that the world that we go back into in a few weeks and months' time is going to be challenging and different. Now, I think that's a positive, and the Chamber will be there to support that. As far as our sessions are concerned, we have further sessions already planned for the 21st and the 28th, all around, again, business needs with focuses on cash flow and funding and other matters, and we'll keep you fully advised of those themes as they come through. But book your place, register your position, and know that every Tuesday at 9:30, Chamber of Solutions is there to help you. And that's throughout April and beyond. Thank you very much to the whole of the audience, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, Ross. For those left, we've got a quick poll just to get some feedback from you. Just 2 questions that will help us get a sense of how today has gone. So I'm going to launch that poll now. 2 simple questions. For those that are still on, you can respond now. We can build on the feedback. I think we've got 22 people. Any more people left to complete? Okay. All close. Good, good. So that is it for this session. I'm going to stop recording now.